Burning Point.
Hello and welcome to the show with me, Katerina Kudashkina. On the 20th of January, President Obama is delivering his annual State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. To quote a brief letter John Boehner, the House Speaker, wrote to his president, "The new year will bring a new American Congress, and with it, the opportunity to continue our work to build a stronger economy and secure a better future for our country." The President's remarks will inform our efforts to address the people's priorities, he said. According to Princeton economists Alan S. Blinder, who is a former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and Mark Watson, quoted in the Time magazine, even though the U.S. economy had improved substantially in recent years, Democrats lost decidedly in many sections of the nation. Democrats failed to excite voter support partly because average American workers had seen little or no personal economic improvement in the years of the Obama presidency and Democratic influence in Washington. End quote. Now we are continuing to discuss the current state of the U.S. economy and the achievements of the U.S. President, Mr. Obama, with our guest speaker, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant U.S. Treasury Secretary. So, what are the achievements of the U.S. President Barack Obama?
Well, he has achieved the agenda of the neoconservatives and the military security complex. He has demonized Russia and its president. He has broken up the economic and political relationships between Russia and Europe. He has secured the agenda of Wall Street by establishing through the Department of Justice that there would be no prosecution of the criminal gangsters that dislocated the American financial system and ripped off millions of people. He has achieved the agenda of the lawlessness of the United States, having determined that the people who tortured detainees will not be prosecuted, even though torture is a felony under United States law and also is prohibited under international law. He has achieved the agenda of the Israel lobby by continuing the wars against Muslims in the Middle East, and he's done his best to achieve the agenda of agribusiness in Monsanto by continuing to allow the production and sale of genetically modified organisms without any studies proving their safety, and he has done his best to achieve the agenda of the extractive industries, oil, mining, and timber. So on the whole, he has been, from the standpoint of 6 powerful private interest groups that rule the United States, and indeed much of the world, Obama has been amazingly successful, perhaps the most successful of all presidents.
Dr. Roberts, I also read some studies suggesting that there is increased concern in analytical communities about the future of the banking system, because they are saying that, in fact, the biggest banks are coming back to their pre-crisis policies, which is indiscriminate lending, and that could end in another wave of crisis. But certainly bankers are clever enough not to realize that. So is it also part of the neocons agenda?
The Wall Street's agenda, of course, benefits from the neoconservative agenda, because if the neoconservatives achieve more American hegemony over other economies, then it opens the door for the financial imperialism of the large American banks. So in that sense, their agendas are allied, the neoconservatives and Wall Street. As for the banks failing, the big banks have been declared by the United States government to be too big to fail. In other words, the United States government will not permit their failure, and has not, and that is why we had 6 years of what the Federal Reserve, the central bank, called quantitative easing, which is the creation of massive amounts of new dollars in order to purchase the debt-related derivatives on the books of the big banks in order to keep them solvent. So whatever trouble the big banks get into for themselves and whatever trouble they cause the rest of the population, the federal government stands behind them and has declared that it will not permit them to fail. So, yes, there are massive holdings of poorly understood derivative instruments could indeed, again, wreck the economy, not only here but abroad. But there is to be no punishment of these banks other than some relatively small fines.
Is it going to punish world economy?
It could very easily, yes, because the dollar is the world reserve currency, and so much is hooked to that if the derivative bubbles blow up, it can blow up all kinds of markets, not just stock markets and bond markets, but it can blow up commodities markets, oil markets. And this is especially the case when so much of the world's economy is in difficulties, such as Europe, which was already fading into recession and high unemployment prior to the sanctions that Washington required Europe to impose on Russia, which has further hurt Europe. So the collapse of the financial system would have consequences in most parts of the world unstable.
Which means that President Obama is not the worst president in the history of the United States, the way he's been described in the media, right? I mean, he's been doing his job.
From the standpoint of the public interest and the interest of peace, he is probably the worst. Certainly, he's every bit as bad as George W. Bush. But from the standpoint of the 5 or 6 powerful interest groups who control the government through their campaign donations, Obama is extremely successful because he has achieved the agenda of those people. So Obama is successful for Wall Street, for the military security complex, for the Israel lobby, for agribusiness, but he is unsuccessful for the American people, for the peoples of the world, for peace.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, that was Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Treasury Secretary in the administration of President Ronald Reagan. This is Burning Point. We're discussing the economic achievements of Obama's team. In fact, banking sector in its current state is keeping the whole of the Western economy hostage. And we are continuing to discuss the issue with our guest speaker, Fredrik Erixon, who is the director and co-founder of the European Center for International Political Economy based in Brussels.
There are still risks associated with the financial sector, and that risk is, you can find it in many different parts of the world. Obviously in Europe, where banks remain fragile and where there are remaining doubts about their solidity even after the stress test and the asset quality review that the European Central Bank did earlier this autumn. But we also have growing financial instabilities in China, in Russia, and in other parts of the world too. And I think given the role of banks in the financial sector in the world economy, that remains a risk factor. The overall political environment in the world, of course, is another one where there are different hotspots in different parts of the world that all of them can have, or at least they can make a serious dent into the economic prospects for the world economy if they're not managed properly. I think there are issues related to the way that central banks are planning for 2015 at a time when the US Fed is scaling back its monetary stimulus, at the same time as we're seeing other countries beginning to doubt the effect of the monetary stimulus they have used in the past. So the extent to which that you're going to have a stop-go sort of central bank policy where central banks at one point or in one country is going to stamp on the pedal at the same time as they may do the opposite in other parts of the world or perhaps at another point in time for the same central bank. So I think that's, I'd say, for the financial sector, central banks, and geopolitics, I think that's my three areas of downside risk for 2015.
You said, given the role the banks are playing in the current situation, are there any indications that this role could be somehow reviewed or revised or corrected?
Well, I mean, the entire world is moving gradually towards a different policy for banks. And give it another 2 years, we're going to have the new Basel rules to kick in on the capitalization of banks. And I wouldn't be surprised to see governments taking further actions a few years down the road in order to impose even stronger capital adequacy demands on banks. But for the time being, that's difficult because banks in many different parts of the world are trying to recover the balance sheets from the pre-crisis era and from developments during the crises. This, of course, is especially true in Europe, but it's also true in other parts of the world. And it's difficult to achieve improvements on the balance sheet at the same time as economies are growing slowly and at the same time as governments are putting even tougher capitalization demands on banks. The more that governments are trying to press on banks right now in order to shore up their balance sheets, the less capable banks are going to be to lend to the economy. And if they can't lend to the economy, that's going to have a detrimental effect on economic growth. So I think that sort of two-step dance is a difficult one to do, and it's not one where central banks and governments have acted in a coordinated way in the past years. They've rather taken policies in different directions.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Fredrik Erixon, the director and co-founder of the European Center for International Political Economy, based in Brussels.
Coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance.
It would be a decision which could only be taken once.
There's no argument over the choice between peace and war.
Unconfirmed reports about Gaddafi being captured.
This morning, I want to talk about the future of Europe.
Burning Point.
Hello and welcome to the show with me, Ekaterina Kudashkina. We're continuing to discuss the role the banking sector is playing in the global economy and geopolitics too, in the second part of our program, and this is our guest speaker. I'm very happy to present to you Peter Koenig, former World Bank economist, currently based in Zurich.
On the weekend of November 16th, at the G20 meeting in Brisbane, they endorsed the proposal which is called, has this fancy name, it's called Financial Stability Board's Adequacy of Loss-Absorbing Capacity of Global Systematically Important Banks in Resolution. I have to write it down to remember the title, and nobody really understands what it means, but it basically means that there is a Financial Stability Board that can decide now. The US has it, the European Commission has it. The Financial Stability Board can decide which bank is insolvent and how it has to rescue itself. This completely changes the rules of banking as we know it. And mind you, and this is another important factor, the G20 have no international legal standing. They are self-nominated, self-designated group of elitist countries, or rather their leaders who have decided to rule the world. There is no UN resolution approving the G20 as a legal international entity, a decision-making organization, nothing at all. They can even decide, the G20, they can even decide to exclude a leader they don't like, as the G8 did, as I remember, the G8 is a concentrated form of the G20. When they recently decided that they didn't like President Putin, they just excluded him. Mm-hmm. And it's now called the G7. Terrible. Mm-hmm. So that's the freedom. They have absolutely no legal standing, yet they decide over the savings and social systems that the people have worked for all their lives, how it should be managed, and when it can be stolen. So this illegal group of so-called world leaders, all of course follow the destructive neoliberal doctrine. They have decided that the too-big-to-fail banks, some people abbreviate them the TBTF banks, should stay in business, whatever comes, but no longer with tax money, but with the savings of their clients, which they simply can confiscate and convert from debt to assets. So simple. And Cyprus is even a smaller country, considered really not very important. And if people worldwide, or at least in Europe, would not react in protest, it was considered a new methodology of saving the financial system. Of course, at the cost of small savers and, as I said earlier, for the enrichment of the elite.
Well,
as with each one of these crises, the gap between rich and poor grows. And I just heard in the Swiss news that even in Switzerland, they predict a lower growth in the future because the gap between rich and poor has growing rather rapidly, which they then say is the reason for lower growth. But of course, it's much more complex. But that's part of the manipulation of the people. So in Cyprus, people did not react. So the system was institutionalized. Now, in fact, this Financial Stability Board I mentioned before, that was rubber-stamped in Brisbane, has become a de facto law that can be now institutionalized by every country. And it has in Europe, it has been already approved, as I said also earlier, by the European Commission. So it's already a fact that in the future, countries of the European Union with banks that are insolvent and the Financial Security Board will make sure they will call their banks to duty to bail themselves in.
But that cannot go on forever, because when the gap is growing, the social instability is growing.
Absolutely, and of course what can be stolen will become less, because take Greece, they basically have no longer a social system which belongs to the people. It's all been privatized, so they have absolutely no saying anymore about the social system. And that was the purpose of it. So if this continues, then eventually the system will collapse. The sad story is that nobody talks about it, so the people are really kept ignorant. The leaders don't talk about it. I mean, this was a little notice somewhere buried in the mainstream media, the rubber stamping at the G20 meeting in Brisbane of this crazy law. So if people would know that their savings are at stake, I think there would be a run on the banks, absolutely, and very quickly. That was, of course, the end of the financial system, of our Western financial system. And I think it may happen. I think it eventually more and more people will become aware of it, because there's internet, and I write a lot about it. There are lots of other people who write about it, and you talk about it now. And so I believe the awareness is growing. And if this really happens, then our Western financial system will be collapsing. And that's when we need another system.
And that's when the Western system might take steps to somehow protect itself.
Right. So one of the things that if you look at the gold, the proportionate gold, Switzerland has still, with only their 7%, has proportionately and per capita the most gold in the world. But let's forget that. Look at the U.S. They report gold holdings of somewhat like 8,200 tons, which they say constitutes 72% of their reserves. That's quite a lot. Germany has 3.3 thousand or 4,000 tons of gold, which is about 2/3 of their total reserves, and so on. And some European countries have much more gold than others, and especially the U.S. It looks to me as if, and they probably have much more gold which is reported. That is my guess. I have no proof for it, and of course gold is a very secret, shiny metal. Nobody really wants to talk how much they have and where it is stored. But my guess is that they have much more, and so does Russia, and so certainly does China, much more than they report. And the reason is because I could imagine that if a system collapses, they would suddenly go back to the gold standard, to some form of a gold standard. It doesn't have to be the same. Of course, it wouldn't be the same as it was in the 70s, as it was in 1944 until 1971, defined by the Bretton Woods meeting. But it would be some kind of a gold standard which would bind currencies to gold. And if you have a lot of gold, then of course your currency is safe, and all those who do not have that gold and depend on other reserves would basically bear the brunt. That would be a possibility.
Yes.
No, I hope it will not. I hope the rest of the world will not accept that and will really require another backing, a physical backing. For me, the gold backing has never been really a solution. It is really, as I said earlier, you can't feed the people with it. You only feed illusions that you have gold. And what can you do with it in the end? Its industrial worth is, I believe, about maybe 5 to 15%. So it's really highly speculative. Now, a new financial system or monetary system should be really backed by the sovereign output of a country, by the economic strength of a country.
This is Burning Point. We're discussing the role of the banking sector in the global economy and geopolitics. Our guest speaker is Peter Koenig, former World Bank economist. What I'm actually concerned about, when we're talking about financial stability boards, etc., so these are the instruments which the existing banking system, with all its schemes and with its virtual money, is inventing to protect itself, right? Now, do I get it right that there are only two financial stability boards, one in the U.S. and one in the European continent? Is my understanding correct?
Right. Well, there are other institutions which back that financial stability board, but they're not that important for the moment. There is also in Europe, particularly, they have created something like a fund, a stability fund, which doesn't exist yet, and I think they are aiming for its physical existence in 2016. And it depends not only on the creation, but also on how much money people put into that fund. And that fund would be then helping to bail in or bail out the insolvent banks. But already now it is very clear that it wouldn't even cover a fraction of what a bank would owe when it collapses. So it's really not important.
But as to the decision-making, it looks pretty much centralized.
Oh, yes, absolutely. You're right. The people in Europe, they have totally lost their sovereignty. They're totally controlled by Brussels or by the European Central Bank and have no more say. Switzerland is a little bit an exception because they're not part of the Eurozone, but they are certainly very, very closely linked to the Eurozone. And by this forced devaluation of 2011, as you may know, they have devalued the Swiss franc by force to tie it closer to the euro to make the Swiss industry more competitive, or again competitive, which they felt Switzerland wouldn't be. That in itself was already a sham. But so the Swiss franc is, even though still more or less independent, it's also tied to the euro. And the Norwegian crown, this is very similar. It's tied to the euro. So you have actually 30 European countries that have basically lost their sovereignty by the institutionalizing of a banking system, of the stability board, which decides which bank has to go and which bank has to live.
Which implies that crucial decisions are taken by a handful of people. So there is something known as conspiracy theory, but can you help drawing parallels? A handful of people are taking decisions on behalf of a good part of the world, and their essence, that money which is virtual, which is losing its value. Well, isn't it a good enough reason to start a third world war, is it?
Well, I hope not.
But how responsible are those guys?
That's why my hope is, and of course I understand that this cannot happen from one day to another, but my hope is that the new monetary system will see the light of the day soon. And I think the beginnings have already happened, by a very close collaboration of the central banks of Russia and China. They have already a regular currency swap arrangement so that they don't have to, their trading doesn't have to go through Wall Street as it used to be, so they deal in their own currencies, absolutely detached from the dollar, which I think is a good thing. And if you look at these two countries together, alone they control about I think, 27 or so % of the world GDP. And if you add the other BRICS together, which is, of course, not so easy to bring them all under the same roof, but if you add them together, then it would be a third of the world GDP. And if they then together, maybe it starts simply with Russia and China, and some other countries may join, as was probably an announcement, or could almost be considered an announcement of the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, where Iran and Mongolia and Pakistan and India were invited also to join the organization. And if that actually materializes, then this bloc gains in strength and could easily issue their own currency. Of course, they don't want from one day to another to destroy the dollar alliance, because that would mean their clientele would be broke. So that is not the purpose. The purpose is to have a gradual shift, gradually people or countries rather shifting to this new system, because I'm sure and I know that there are many who would do that tomorrow if the system would exist, because the reason they don't do it is simply because they are afraid of the U.S., of sanctions and of maybe even of war, of invasion. But this may change if there is physically a new system available, and I really hope that it will happen soon. Because otherwise, yes, there is a risk of war. You're right, but I do hope that can be avoided. Because if the system itself, as it is now, produces war, I mean, without that fiat money that is printed at will, you couldn't finance a war machine, as the U.S. is doing. Mm-hmm. So if you break that system, you can stop basically wars, maybe not from one day to another, but also gradually you bring an era of peace through economics and not through killing to the world.
Dr. Koenig, thank you very much. And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Peter Koenig, former World Bank economist. And now we end this edition of Burning Point, brought to you by me, Katerina Kudoshkina. Thank you so much for staying with us. Goodbye and take care.